The lobby smelled like pine cleaner and expensive sunscreen when the receptionist finally stopped typing and looked at me. Her smile was polite and completely apologetic. She explained that the reservation showed a large suite, 2 connecting rooms, and absolutely nothing under my name. I stood still. I did not panic. I simply watched her tap the keyboard again, hoping the screen would fix itself. Behind me, my sister shifted her weight and sighed. She leaned forward and told the clerk that a failure like me never really needed a proper room anyway, since I usually just paid for upgrades to stay useful. The words landed exactly where she intended. Heavy. Familiar. But the old panic never arrived. Instead, a quiet clarity settled in my chest. For years, I had swallowed those insults. I had opened my banking app to cover every missing balance. I treated my own discomfort as the price of keeping the peace. I remembered every wired transfer sent before midnight. I recalled every canceled vacation fund diverted to cover their mortgage gap. I remembered the quiet phone calls where I answered their sudden emergencies while my own plans dissolved into nothing. I never asked for gratitude. I simply hoped my silence would eventually earn me a place at the table. But guilt never holds a table steady. It only tilts until you slide off. I realized that truth while standing in that bright, crowded lobby. The old instinct to fix everything finally dissolved. I replaced it with a single, steady question. What happens when I stop paying for invisibility? The truth was simple. I was done. Today, that cost felt like a receipt I was finally ready to close. I did not reach for my wallet. I did not apologize for standing in a space I had secretly funded. I just asked the clerk to print the original booking confirmation and the exact timestamp when the final payment cleared. The paper slid across the marble. It was crisp and undeniable. I watched my sister smile flicker as she realized the numbers belonged to my card, my miles, and my account. The clerk waited. The lobby hummed. I folded the receipt and stepped back from the counter. The real conversation would not happen here. It would happen when they finally understood the money was never a gift. The ledger always outlives the excuses. 3 years of quiet compliance looks exactly like a series of glowing screens in a dark apartment. I can still see the pale blue light of my banking app illuminating the ceiling while I confirmed another automatic transfer. I remember the exact date on the ledger. 18 months ago, I wired $2,000 to cover the gap in my mother's mortgage. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself they were just between paychecks. I sat at my kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee and clicked send, hoping the gesture would finally buy me a seat at the dinner table instead of just funding it. The next morning, my phone vibrated with a polished text from my mother. She called me her lifeline, her responsible child, her quiet miracle. I saved the message. I read it when the guilt crept in later. I never questioned why miracles never got invited to Sunday brunch unless someone needed a ride. The pattern solidified quickly. I canceled a weekend trip to Portland because my sister's car lease required a cosigner. I pulled up the dealership portal, filled out the digital forms, and attached my credit report while she watched television on the couch. I did not ask for compensation. I simply nodded when she said she would pay me back eventually. I learned to read the subtle shifts in their tone. A missed call meant a utility notice. A sudden text about a child's tuition meant another autopay setup. I built my entire life around their emergencies. I told myself it was love. I told myself family means carrying each other through rough patches. But rough patches do not become permanent landscapes unless someone keeps paving the road for you. The screenshots in my archived folders told a different story. They showed a steady stream of outgoing transfers. They highlighted the exact dates when my personal savings dipped below $300 while their vacation photos uploaded in real time. I kept a dedicated folder labeled Family Expenses, filled with PDF statements and payment confirmations that proved I was not imagining the drain. I printed the auto-pay schedules and highlighted the recurring charges that vanished into their accounts every single month. The paper trail left no room for honest or polite denial. I watched the numbers stack against their excuses. I saw the exact moment my patience fractured. The math was brutal and unforgiving. I finally understood the truth. Every receipt confirmed it. I started noticing the timing. Every financial request arrived right after I mentioned a new goal. Every apology sounded rehearsed, smooth, and completely detached from action. My mother perfected the art of emotional deflection. She would lean across the counter, touch my hand, and remind me that blood is thicker than water. She never mentioned that water dries up if you keep pouring it into a cracked foundation. The realization did not arrive in a single dramatic moment. It accumulated slowly, like dust settling on untouched furniture. I watched my sister book flights to Cabo while complaining about her credit score. I listened to my father laugh about his new truck while ignoring the overdue notices on his own accounts. I realized this upcoming resort trip was never about bonding. It was a test. It was a quiet experiment to see how much more I would carry before I finally folded under the weight. I had spent years mistaking obligation for affection. I had treated my bank account as an extension of their comfort. But standing in that hotel lobby, I finally saw the ledger clearly. The money was not a gift. The silence was not peace. It was a transaction they expected me to repeat forever. I felt the old hesitation dissolve into something colder and sharper. The instinct to apologize vanished. The need to prove my worth evaporated. I understood that keeping the peace meant keeping myself in the background, and I was finished with the background. The old rhythm broke the moment I stopped reaching for my wallet. I knew exactly what I needed to do next. The air in the lobby felt suddenly heavier, but my breathing stayed steady. I watched my mother adjust her sunglasses and prepare the usual speech about flexibility and sacrifice. I let the silence stretch just long enough to make them uncomfortable. For years, I would have already reached for my debit card. I would have apologized for the booking error and quietly covered the extra room charge to keep the peace. That version of me died somewhere between the last wire transfer and the cold receipt in my hand. I stepped back from the marble counter and told the clerk we would not be upgrading. The words landed softly, but the shift in the room was immediate. My sister let out a sharp breath and stepped closer. Her posture rigid with sudden irritation. She asked what that meant, her tone sharpening into the familiar blade of entitlement. I looked at her directly and explained that I was not funding a second room, and I was certainly not covering the resort fees they had ignored for weeks. Her smirk held for exactly 2 seconds before it fractured. She expected my usual retreat. She expected me to fold into the background and pay for the privilege of staying invisible. I did not give her that satisfaction. Instead, I opened my leather portfolio and laid 3 printed pages on the counter. The paper slid across the polished surface without a sound. Each page contained a clean, chronological ledger of every payment I had made on their behalf over the past 3 years. Mortgage gaps, utility balances, lease deposits, and vacation auto-pays all lined up in neat columns with exact dates and confirmation numbers. My mother reached out to touch the top sheet, then pulled her hand back as if the ink might burn her. Her polished composure cracked at the edges. She started speaking in that practiced, hurried rhythm she always used when cornered. She reminded me of everything they had given me growing up, of the sacrifices they claimed to make, of the unspoken debt I supposedly carried. I listened without interrupting. I let her words bounce off a wall of quiet certainty I had finally built. I waited until her voice ran out of breath before I spoke. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was surgical. I told them the ledger was not an argument. It was a statement of fact, and it explained exactly why I was stepping back. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone. I opened the banking portal they had shared with me years ago and navigated to the Account Management tab. My fingers moved slowly, deliberately, and with zero hesitation. I revoked the shared credit card access I had maintained to cover their daily emergencies. I tapped through the autopay settings and disabled every recurring subscription I had been quietly funding, from the streaming services to the premium data plans. Each confirmation screen flashed a quiet green checkmark. I did not announce what I was doing. I simply let the digital receipts speak for me. The contrast between their chaotic expectations and my calm execution filled the space. They were used to panic, to frantic negotiations, to emotional bargaining that always ended with my wallet open. They were not prepared for steady boundaries. My sister finally looked down at the printed ledger and traced a column of numbers with her fingertip. Her eyes widened as she read the totals. The realization hit her like a physical weight. She understood that the vacation infrastructure was collapsing in real time. My mother's voice dropped into a lower register, the kind that usually signaled impending guilt trips or sudden tears. She asked what I expected to happen next, her tone shifting from mockery to quiet panic. I told her exactly what would happen. The resort would process the reservation as it was booked. The rooms would remain paid. The remaining balance would come from their own accounts starting tomorrow. I explained that I had already contacted the financial institutions to separate my name from their shared liabilities. I emphasized that I was not punishing them. I was simply refusing to subsidize a dynamic that treated my contributions as infinite. I closed my portfolio and stepped back. The lobby chatter faded as I watched them process the shift. The ledger stayed on the marble, a quiet monument to silent labor. I turned toward the glass doors and felt the weight lift. The morning sun warmed the pavement outside. I knew the consequences were beginning. The financial notices would arrive soon. Tomorrow would bring the truth. The next morning arrived with a pale quiet light that made the resort courtyard feel entirely different. I sat at a small iron table near the pool entrance, watching the automatic glass doors slide open. My mother walked through first, followed closely by my sister and father. Their shoulders were tense, their expressions carefully arranged for a confrontation they expected to win. They had spent the night rehearsing the usual script. They anticipated tears, apologies, and the familiar cycle of emotional bargaining that always ended with me reaching for my wallet again. They wanted a breakdown they could manage. They wanted guilt they could weaponize. I offered them none of it. I simply opened the manila folder resting beside my coffee and laid out 3 printed statements on the table. The paper reflected the morning sun. I watched my sister drop her sunglasses onto the stone patio as she read the header line on the first page. Her breath hitched, just slightly, before she forced her posture straight. She had expected me to fold. She had expected the familiar collapse of boundaries that had defined our dynamic for years. Instead, she faced a quiet wall of procedural clarity. I explained the steps in a measured tone that left no room for deflection. I told them I had formally removed my name as an authorized user on the primary credit account they shared with my mother. The removal request went through the issuer portal at 4, and the confirmation arrived 12 minutes later. I explained that the change would reflect on their monthly statement cycle within 14 days, and that all pending transactions would immediately fall back to the primary cardholder. I detailed the auto-pay cancellations I processed for utilities and streaming subscriptions, noting that each service sends a final notice 7 days before termination, giving them a narrow window to update payment methods. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply outlined the timeline, the confirmation codes, and the exact dates when the financial tether would fully detach. My father shifted his weight, his jaw tightening as he processed the reality of what I was saying. He opened his mouth, likely to launch into the familiar lecture about loyalty and family duty, but the words caught in his throat. The old script relied on emotional chaos. It relied on me getting defensive, on me crying, on me trying to explain myself until I exhausted my own arguments. I refused to play that game. I replaced it with clean, verifiable facts. I pointed to the second page, which showed the exact routing for the mortgage gap coverage I maintained for 18 months. I explained that the co-signer removal paperwork had already been filed with the lender, and that they would receive a formal notice regarding the revised payment schedule within 10 business days. I emphasized that this was not punishment. It was structural. I had spent years treating their emergencies as my permanent responsibility. I had mistaken financial exhaustion for love. I had allowed guilt to dictate my budget until my own life shrank to fit their demands. That era ended the moment I stopped accepting their apologies as currency. My sister finally looked away from the ledger, her eyes scanning the courtyard as if searching for an escape from the truth settling around her. She realized the vacation structure was collapsing not through drama, but through deliberate administrative action. The rooms would charge their cards starting today. The rental car agreement would require a new primary driver. The resort activities they booked under my membership points were already flagged for cancellation. The entire ecosystem of convenience I built for them was dissolving into standard procedures, standard deadlines, and standard consequences. I closed the folder and slid it toward the center of the table. I told them family does not mean funding comfort while treating you as disposable. I told them love does not require financial submission, and loyalty should never demand silent erosion. The courtyard remained quiet, save for the distant hum of pool filtration and the rustle of palm fronds. I stood up, adjusted my coat, and picked up my bag. The weight that had pressed against my ribs for 3 years finally lifted. I did not look back at the table. I walked toward the resort exit, leaving the old narrative exactly where it belonged. The morning air felt clean, and the path ahead belonged to me. The quiet hit me before the keycard even registered on the lock. I dropped my suitcase on the hardwood floor and listened to the empty room settle into a rhythm I had not known for years. There were no vibrating phones demanding urgent favors. No sudden texts requesting wire transfers for emergencies that somehow always aligned with my paydays. I walked to the window and pulled back the heavy curtain, watching the late afternoon light stretch across the parking lot below. The silence felt heavy at first, almost uncomfortable, because I had spent so long mistaking noise for connection. I had confused constant availability with devotion. I had let my own exhaustion masquerade as loyalty. But as I stood there, feeling the cool glass against my palm, the weight finally lifted. It did not feel like loss. It felt like breathing. People love to call it abandonment when someone finally stops funding their own erasure. They dress up obligation in the language of blood and duty. They insist that love requires endless sacrifice, as if the person giving should quietly vanish to keep the balance steady. Every transfer I made bought me temporary silence, but never lasting respect. Every cancelled plan bought me polite nods, but never genuine inclusion. I learned the hard way that balance built on one side carrying everything is just a slow collapse waiting to happen. I thought walking away would feel cruel. I imagined guilt would claw at my ribs the moment I stopped answering the late-night calls. But guilt only thrives in darkness and uncertainty. Once you turn on the lights and read the receipts, guilt has nowhere to hide. I was not punishing them by stepping back. I was surviving the version of myself I had buried under 3 years of silent compliance. I chose myself not out of bitterness, but out of necessity. You cannot pour from a hollowed vessel forever. There is a quiet difference between love and obligation that most families never want to acknowledge. Love expands when you ask for space. Obligation shrinks when you set a boundary. Love respects your limits without demanding justification. Obligation treats your limits as a personal insult that must be dismantled through guilt or shame. You are not responsible for managing their discomfort when they lose access to your resources. Their frustration is not your burden to carry. I finally understood that distinction while sitting on a neatly made bed in a room I paid for with my own signature. The realization did not arrive with fireworks or dramatic vindication. It arrived as a steady, unshakable clarity. I no longer needed to prove my worth through financial submission. I no longer needed to apologize for prioritizing my own peace. The ledger proved I had already given more than enough. The truth is simple and repeatable. You do not owe anyone the right to drain you until you disappear. Real connection does not require you to shrink your life to fit their comfort. Real family does not treat your generosity as an unlimited resource. I closed my eyes and listened to the steady hum of the air conditioning. It sounded like freedom. It sounded like a life finally belonging to the person living it. I thought about everyone who has ever sat in a quiet room wondering if stepping back means breaking a bond. I thought about the countless people who mistake their own exhaustion for failure. I want them to hear this clearly. Setting a boundary is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of preservation. You are allowed to stop carrying what was never yours to hold. You are allowed to choose peace over performance, clarity over chaos, and self-respect over silent resentment. Take a deep breath. Acknowledge the weight you have been carrying. Place it down gently. Watch how much lighter the path becomes. The world will not fall apart when you finally say no. It will simply make room for you to finally exist. 3 days later, my phone vibrated once on the quiet hotel desk. It was a single message from my sister. No emojis, no dramatic pleas, just a brief acknowledgement that the autopay notifications had finally cleared and the accounts were now updating to their names. I read it twice, felt the familiar urge to reply with reassurance, and deliberately set the device face down. There would be no reconciliation text. There would be no carefully crafted apology designed to pull me back into the old cycle. The boundary had been established through action, not negotiation, and silence was the only appropriate response. I watched the evening light shift across the wall, noticing how the room felt lighter without the constant hum of anticipation. For years, I had waited for a thank you that never arrived. I had expected a moment of mutual understanding that would magically erase the ledger. I finally realized that closure does not require their permission. It only requires my willingness to stop waiting. The message was not a bridge. It was simply proof that the new structure was holding. I packed my bag slowly, folding each sweater with deliberate care, and checked the window one last time before heading out. The resort courtyard looked peaceful in the fading dusk. I stepped into the cool evening air and felt a quiet certainty settle over my shoulders. Walking away did not break me. It finally allowed me to stand straight. If you have ever carried the weight of family expectations until your own life disappeared into the background, you already know how heavy that silence can become. You know what it feels like to mistake exhaustion for loyalty. You know the exact moment you realize peace costs more than staying quiet. I want to hear from you. What was the first boundary you set that actually changed your life? Did they accept it, or did they fight to keep you exactly where you were? Share your story below, because every quiet act of self-preservation truly matters, and your voice deserves to be heard. The path forward does not require permission. It only requires you to finally choose yourself. The evening wind carried the sound of distant traffic, unbothered and steady. I walked toward the parking lot with my keys in hand, completely ready for whatever came next.